This is the Mormon Mixed Faith Marriage Podcast with certified life coach Brooke Booth, episode number 152. Before we had the panel discussion, the podcast before that, we talked about internalized gaslighting or self-gaslighting. This podcast follows a similar theme. We're talking about spiritual bypass. They have a lot of similarities, so I'm lumping them together in close succession. I'm talking about these for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons is when spiritual bypass and self-gaslighting go unchecked because you're not even realizing you're doing it. This is one of those areas in your marriage where your intention might be golden. You might have the best intention in being a great supportive spouse, being kind and loving and generous and compassionate and all of those things, but the impact you're having might be quite the opposite. And I want to point that out because you may have perfect intentions, and that still does not prevent very harmful impact with your marriage and with your spouse. In these areas, the gaslighting, the spiritual bypass, quite a bit of other things I talk about in this podcast, when we're not aware of the impact we're having, even though we may have really good intentions, our good intentions does not erase the impact we're having on our marriage. And so I create this podcast in large part to help give you some more awareness, some more tools, so that you're not like a bull in a, china shop. You may have very good intentions and you may be just wanting to try to help and to show support and to love your spouse. But if the impact you're creating in your marriage is still incredibly harmful and hurtful and painful for your spouse, your good intention is not going to save the day. Okay, so with that little bit of a gentle reminder, let's talk about spiritual bypass. I've talked about this in the past on the podcast, but I wanted to go a little bit more in depth because I've recently, I'm using that word a little lightly, probably a year ago, maybe even 6 months ago, I read a book by Laura Anderson. I highly recommend, by the way. This is also a recommendation for this book called When Religion Hurts You by Laura Anderson. It's Anderson with an S-O-N. She approaches this idea of looking at religion from a way, like, if you've ever familiar with trauma studies and people talk about trauma, there's like ACEs and in childhood and advanced, I'm sorry, I said advanced, but I meant adverse experiences. That's ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. She takes a lot of those principles and she ties it to, sometimes this happens to people in religious experiences. So she calls them adverse religious experiences, ARAs, and she talks about these in her books, and in her work, in her body of work. And I found her ideas to be very interesting and talk a little bit more about spiritual bypass in the podcast, and it's based because it's mind to give a shout out to her and her amazing work. It's like the how to get there, but it's how we take religion or spirituality and we use it to bypass from like real. So if you think of like a bypass surgery in your heart, you're going around the blockage to create, you're creating a bypass. We do this with religion all the time because we take religion as sort of a shortcut or a bypass from real emotional work, from developing real emotional resiliency, emotional maturity, skills around emotional processing, and skills um, like reality even. I'll talk about that. Religious or spiritual bypass, it's bypassing from the emotional experience. Because a lot of times, this was certainly my experience, you are taught that certain emotions just simply aren't righteous. And spiritual bypass, because those are not emotions to be having, those are not righteous emotions, those indicate sin or lack of closeness with God or lack of spirituality. A lot of times, if you're feeling sad, lonely, disappointed, frustrated, grief, that's not a good thing from a religious perspective. You should be grateful. You should be peaceful. You should comfort it. And so, because we don't give full permission, experience the full range of bypass becomes quite necessary and quite a standard practice. And because of that, because of the tendency to spiritually bypass, we lose skills. We lose out on how to develop the skills to manage and process disappointment and grief and sorrow, anger and loneliness, and all of those types of emotions. We of learning how to hold multiple emotions at once. Like you can be grateful and disappointed at the same time. You can be compassionate and upset at the same time. Resilience, the processing around a lot of emotions because we don't give ourselves permission to fully acknowledge and explain because of our rush to spiritually bypass. In the Young Women manuals and some of the stories, and again, this is an example of where intentions are so good, but the impact is just unfortunately not. Because I do believe the people in very good intentions, the impact. So there's a story of where a woman received a phone call that her mother had just died. And within 15 minutes, I give you not the story, said 15 minutes. I kid you not. Within 15 minutes, needed to be fearful that the suffering had ended and that she was not allowed to feel any grief or sadness or loss at her mother's passing. She was only allowed to feel and love. Now, this is um, emotionally stunt one's growth. This is emotionally gaslighting yourself. This is emotionally destructive. When we give ourselves permission to feel all of our emotions, to process through them, and to learn to tolerate them, and to be at peace with all of our emotions. And I think this is what's, here's another example. This was a story in the Young Women Manual. Literally these facts. I am not making these up. She recently lost her father, moved to a new town, had a hard day at school. She was feeling lonely, low. And in the story, she herself are feeling this way. And because this was her friend, this was a story, like the lesson was on friendship and how you should be friends, feel comforted, and she shouldn't be feeling these negative emotions. And, you know, as a young woman, I probably listened to that's true. We should be comforted and never feel sad or lonely or grief. But as an adult and a life coach now who meets with clients regularly about their emotions, I was so upset. And loneliness are so normal and so important to be acknowledged, awareness, and to create the ability to feel them and to be okay. And to understand that that's exactly how you should be feeling in a circumstance like that. And yes, at the same comfort from having a relationship with Jesus. I don't want to discount that, not at the expense of working through your own emotional experience. I do feel like these stories were set up where there was no permission granted to explain these quote unquote negative emotions. And I think these are just quick examples of how we teach us in our families, in our church systems, in our lessons to our children. And what causes us to ignore very real emotions that we have? We fail to actually develop emotional skills and emotional resilience because we shouldn't feel that way. We should just be comforted or grateful. This is spiritual bias. Okay, so how does it happen in mixed faith marriage? Maybe you're not given space to be angry at the church. Maybe you're not given space to be sad about your spouse, faith transition, or taking off garments. Because those emotions, you shouldn't be feeling that. You shouldn't ever be feeling angry or disappointed or, or peaceful because of your. Maybe there's no space in your marriage to actually talk about and hold space for each other's negative emotions. This was absolutely negative emotions I have made my husband incredible because I think to him it felt like we were doing something wrong. I think to him it felt like this was not a good use of our time to explore negative emotions. We shouldn't be having negative emotions because we should just look at the positive and look on the bright side and discuss the good things. And because if we discuss the bad use of our time, we were wallowing or something like this. And I understand his intentions were good. He was just doing what he thought was best for the relationship and for me. But unfortunately, he was just wrong about that. A relationship where people can feel safe to share their emotional reality, where they can show up experiencing and sharing and worthy of exploration, time and worthy of attention in that relationship. Because there are multiple effects, both internally and externally in the relation. And those emotions are not allowed because you shouldn't them, because you should just be having a spiritual bypass around them. Internally, you're not good. That part of you that feels that way isn't good or worthy of time or worthy of relationship. That part of you is not being aired in the relationship, being worked through in the relationship, giving time in the relationship, not valid to be explored. Navigate those difficulties alone. Your marriage is not there to support you. It's only there to give space to you as you practice as you have quote unquote positive emotions. And that's challenging because now you have very conditional support. And again, not because your husband or your wife or your parents or your sister, they want to be conditional. I think they much want to be unconditional, supportive, loving people. But if this happens because they are not even aware, this a million times or just they think it's the best way, but it doesn't impact still. Because if you don't or lack So here are things to consider if you think this is happening in your marriage. Sorry if there was a funny pause there. I'll see if I can edit that out, but I think my internet just split. Here are some questions to consider. How can you learn and become more aware around spiritual bypass? Can you get curious? How might this be impacting your marriage? Again, I know your intention may be good, but what might be the impact? Are you allowing to be to show up, and where are you giving yourself permission to not show up? These are all questions to explore. So you try to get curious around how spiritual bypass might be showing up in your mixed faith marriage.